Hello, Psych 101 sections instructed by Dr. Johnson at the Lincoln University of Missouri. I'm recording this for us on Monday afternoon, March 30th, 2020 at almost 3:15 in the afternoon. And this is part two of the 7 basic affects presentation. In the first part of talking about Dr. Panksepp's 7 basic affects, we talked about what did he mean by affect and what is his interpretation of how it is that our emotional responses are understanding our emotional responses are vital to understanding how we learn, how non-human animals learn. And we said that he argued that the 7 basic affects are the basic tools of the nervous system, that they provide us information, they provide us values. So while we've all start out with a general framework of things that are attractive and things that we want to avoid, this is all individually learned, and it's at one level, it's for humans anyway, it's culturally transmitted, but then also in terms of our individual uh, propensities for being rewarded or punished, um, that sort of accounts for our individual differences. They're judgments that we can see through behavior about whether or not an individual organism finds something to be good or bad. So in this part of the presentation, we're going to talk about two additional aspects of this. One is Panksepp argues that the 7 affects are common to both humans and non-human animals. And secondly, his sort of criteria for what it means for an emotional reaction to be a basic affect, as opposed to something that is sort of built on a combination of more than one affective system. And finally, we're going to look at his list of what the 7 basic affects are. So at the end of the last presentation, we looked at this set of pictures of facial expressions from dogs. And there's some extra stuff up in this unit that I posted about emotional experience in dogs and humans' ability to interpret dogs' emotional experience. Um, Dogs are kind of a special case in terms of like thinking about Dr. Panksepp's argument that the 7 basic affects are common to humans and non-human animals, especially mammals. Um, dogs are a particularly special case because you can make a good argument that humans have had special relationships with dogs as a species for much longer than any other animal that's a domesticated animal. Um, Good evidence suggests that humans and dogs have been close companions for at least 30,000 years. And one of the things that means is that uh, dogs have had, we've put a lot of selective reproduction pressure on dogs and what they look like and how they behave, including their emotional expression that we can interpret. So in the last presentation, we looked briefly at this set of pictures of different facial expressions in dogs. Um, And it included interpretations, what these emotional expressions, what affective systems were being activated. So one of Panksepp's arguments that really attracted my attention when I started paying attention to his work is that the 7 basic affects are commonly shared between humans and some of the non-human animals, especially mammals. And dogs are a great example of that, and kind of a special case. Partly because compared to any of the other animals that humans have domestic relationships with, dogs arguably are our companions of the longest standing. We have good evidence that humans and dogs have been traveling and working and living together for at least 30,000 years. In terms of any other kind of animals that humans have extensive relationships with, whether or not that's cats or any of our agricultural animals, sheep, cattle, pigs and swine, chickens. We're talking like 7 to 10,000 years, but nothing like the amount of time that we've been working with dogs. And that means that we have had a long time to shape in terms of like reproductive selection, in terms of the way that our decisions about how dogs reproduce have influenced how they look and how they behave, and then how they've adjusted to how we behave is kind of unique. So, first off, the idea that we ought to be able to look at a dog and make pretty good guesses about what that animal is feeling and how it's reacting. We have good reason to believe that, but there's still room for a little bit of caution as well. Okay, so there are a number of areas within a discussion of psychological science where I, as an instructor, might have good reason to like give you a signal that, hey, at one point in history, we got ahead of ourselves and thought we knew more about this than we actually did. And that discussion of behaviorism, according to Watson and Skinner, is a great example of that. That's also true when we're talking about how do we interpret animal behavior. Since the late 19th century, there's been a strong rule amongst people who are supposed to be able to think of themselves as rational and educated that we shouldn't anthropomorphize non-human animals. That is, we shouldn't attribute human emotions and intentions to them. The argument there is that like they're not us, they're not biologically us, therefore we shouldn't make any assumptions about understanding their experience and what they're trying to do when they react to something going on in the environment. Dr. Panksepp's argument is really turning that on its head. Dr. Panksepp's argument is saying, no, we ought to be able to make pretty sensible conclusions about what their behavior and their affective expression means. Okay, when we talk about this rule about anthropomorphization, that's a big word, isn't it? That's a $30 word anyway. And so to break this down, sort of anthro means human in general, and generally the root part here, morph, means structure. Don't give a human structure, don't assume a human structure to animal behavior. The way that we get to reinterpret this in terms of considering like a set of basic neural structures that give rise to emotional reactions, and that those emotional reactions give us information about what's good and bad for us in the environment. We're taking the emphasis off of the human ability for language and looking at the logic of what do behaviors and behavioral expressions tell us. So the argument is that, again, the information that emotional reactions give both to the animal or person who's experiencing the emotional reaction and to other people and animals that are observing the reaction, is that they can tell what it's doing for them is giving information about what's good or bad for them in the environment. Do I approach it if it's good? Do I avoid it if it's bad? And then again, that those separate nervous system structures are involved. So I will have posted links to 4 different videos. Just a moment. So I've got 4, I'll have 4 videos up and 2 articles. So essentially with dogs, we've got good evidence that we can become pretty good at understanding what they're expressing. They're paying attention to what we're expressing. So this video, dogs change facial expressions when humans pay attention to them. So we've got evidence for that. This video is a good sort of general outline of how to interpret not just the facial expressions, but the entire affective expression that a dog is showing us. Then in terms of the idea of warning against anthropomorphization, I've got the Guilty Dog number 1 video and the Guilty Dog number 2 video. And so here's something where we may often be overinterpreting or misinterpreting dogs. It's like, we could read this as like, okay, so one of these dogs has chewed up its human's shoes and the insoles in the shoes, and now we're confronting the dogs with the evidence of their wrongdoing, and they're showing guilt. But actually, it might be that what they're actually showing in terms of like they don't want to make eye contact. And if you're happy and they're happy, the dogs want to make eye contact. They're sitting down. They understand that their human is upset with them, and that's what's really causing their apparent discomfort, not because they know that they're guilty, but because their human is being upset with them. So, the 7 basic affects are common to humans and non-human animals. Now we're looking at what is the logic behind Dr. Panksepp's arguments for there being 7. What does he mean by basic affect? So first off, he says, okay, basic affects will be observed as reflexive, unconditioned responses to certain stimuli from the environment. So when we were talking about John Watson and Rosalie Rayner trying to make baby Albert scared of mice and other furry animals, Watson and Rayner understood that it was a natural reflex for Albert to cry when we made a sudden loud sound in close proximity to Albert. So the basic affects are going to be the emotional responses we have to positive or negative stimuli from the environment that are unconditioned. Every time these reflexive unconditioned responses happen, they'll happen in generally the same way. We'll have a coherent and predictable set of behavioral actions and physiological responses that we can measure. So there's the fight or flight response to danger, and then there's also the changes in heart rate, blood pressure, skin conductance, etc., that we can measure that go along with those reactions. 3, this is a point that we've already been making a lot. The basic affects are information about things that are attractive and things that are to be avoided. The new point that we're making here is that this information about what's attractive and what to avoid is going to prioritize where we pay our attention. We're going to be most likely to pay attention to things that are very attractive and things that are very punishing. And our individual differences, our personality variables, are going to have to do with some of us prioritize attraction more than others. Some of us prioritize punishment more than others. The basic affects are elicited, pulled by stimuli from the environment, but once the environment arouses the basic affects, just because the stimulus that aroused them is taken away doesn't mean that the basic affects stop. We continue to remember and think about the experience of a basic affect. So think back to the previous presentation when we were talking about what are the things that are predicted by high scores in neuroticism. People who have relatively high scores in neuroticism think about painful and distressing things more than people who have lower scores. Okay, here's an extension of that. Not only do we continue to consider and think about the things that caused our basic affects, remembering things that happened in the past that were either negative or positive can trigger the basic affect in our experience right now. It's kind of unclear to me how this would work in non-human animals. This ability to think about things that had happened in the past and re-experience the emotional reactions that go along with those things shapes how we think about our plans for the future. So this is one place where Dr. Panksepp's scheme really I think, fixes some of the flaws with B.F. Skinner style behaviorism. Our story that we tell to ourselves about ourselves is not just an accidental side effect. It's not just an epiphenomenon. It gives us useful information about how we want to behave in the future and why that chosen behavior in the future either brings us more things that are rewarding or helps us avoid things that are punishing. So this final point, again, we could talk about this for like a long time. One of the arguments that Dr. Panksepp made about how to establish the overall validity of the 7 basic affect idea is that when we think about psychological disorders, so for instance, in the last presentation, we were talking about the personality disorders where people's consistent behavioral and emotional patterns of reactions and involvement with the environment actually end up getting in the way of living a fully functional life. Is that under or overactivity in those 7 basic affective systems should show up in specific ways in the specific signs and symptoms that people show in terms of mental disorders. So when I teach psychological disorders to upper division students, one of the things that I encourage them to think about is when you're looking at a particular disorder, think about what is this a disorder of? And a lot of the psychiatric disorders that are listed in the DSM-5 are disorders of emotional reaction. So finally, okay, so why it makes sense and how it makes sense to think about the 7 basic affects of as being applicable not just to humans but to other non-human animals. What are the 7 rules that Dr. Panksepp used as the basic of his logic for why the 7? And then finally, how do we determine the validity of any particular basic affect as being basic? How do we determine it's actually basic? And part of that has to do with, can we find specific nervous system activity that is more or less unique to that emotional experience, the particular emotional experience that we're talking about? So we should find subsystems in the brain that are consistent across individuals. We should also find individual differences in these systems based on biology and experience. So part of what I'm offering to us is that if you go back and if the 5-factor model of personality makes sense to you in terms of how it consistently, how the scores on the 5 factors and the facets consistently predict behaviors and emotional experiences, then partly that fits in with this 7 basic affect scheme, where even though the 7 basic affects are more or less universal, we're all going to have more or less of them based on both our inborn, our nature, our biology, but also our experience, our nurture. We ought to be able to both particularly visualize or like using technology that helps us pinpoint where in the brain activity is happening when we're thinking or feeling about a particular thing, and our ability to turn that stuff off or on using localized electrical stimulation of the brain. So the next couple of slides, so what do we mean by fMRI? And this means functional magnetic resonance imaging. And there's two videos up that kind of refer to electrical stimulation of the brain, and we are going to be talking about brain scanning technology throughout the next few parts of the rest of the semester. So here we've got machinery, the functional magnetic resonance imaging technology that allows us to see where in the brain neurons are working, and we can correlate that to listening to sad music or happy music. So in these illustrations, the red areas indicate increased activity, and the blue areas indicate less activity going on. So you can tell it's like, this is like when somebody's listening to negative, like music that's got a negative emotional connotation, music that's got a positive connotation, and music that's got it's unclear whether it's positive or negative, that we've got different amounts of activity going on. The second set of slides is a little bit more particular. So in this column, we've got people who have experienced, in this column, so now we're looking at people who have a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, and we're asking them to think about, to remember certain kinds of experiences. We ask them in this column to remember traumatic experiences, to remember sad experiences, and to remember things that made them anxious. So in the last presentation, we were talking like the core basic negative emotions include depression, anxiety, and anger. And so here we've got the depressive ones. Here we've got the anxious ones. Here we've got the traumatic events that threatened to seriously damage or kill somebody. And we look at one structure in the limbic system called the thalamus. And then we look at another structure which is part of the cerebral cortex called the anterior cingulate cortex. And again, we showed that the levels of activity and the areas that are active are different when people are PTSD victims are remembering traumatic events, sad events, or anxious events. So, okay, so here we've got, here's where in the brain this anterior cingulate cortex is. And here is some of the things that we know that this particular area of the brain are involved in. Both automatic reactions, including increases or decreases in blood pressure or heart rate, but then also in what we think of as higher order functions, the things that we can, to a larger extent, sometimes have more control over. Allocating attention. How do we spend our attention? Anticipating reward. Making decisions about, we're paying attention to this, this is possibly rewarding. Do I wait for that reward? Do I control my impulses and wait for the reward? What's my emotional reaction to getting rewarded or having been frustrated in that? And what does this mean in terms of my decisions about how to behave towards other people? So finally, what are Dr. Panksepp's 7 basic emotions? So in his publications about them, he always, in order to kind of like highlight the fact that he was talking about things that were not just categories of emotional expression and response, but also involve particular structures and systems in the nervous system. He always capitalized them. And one of the things that really actually initially caught my attention is that he classifies looking for things in the environment that are potentially in the future either rewarding or are potentially punishing as a basic motivation, seeking. And in the parentheses after each of these, I've kind of offered like, okay, are these positive? Are these more rewarding? Are they more punishing? And actually, the seeking one kind of goes into both, because what we're looking for in terms of seeking is we're just paying attention in the environment to things that in the future may be rewarding or in the future are to be avoided. Seeking, fear, rage, so they're not exactly the same thing, but they're related. For one thing, things that make us scared tend to make us angry. Lust, being attracted to potentially reproductive kinds of activities. And so that's rewarding or attractive. And then care, which is positive emotional interactions with others. So one of the things, these are separate according to Dr. Panksepp. So in the best of all possible worlds, they go together, but they don't always have to go together. Panic, which is going to be fear turned up to the highest possible level, and then play. So one of the things that, sort of going back to that idea of anthropomorphization, don't attribute human motivations to non-human animals. One of the things that the animal scientists spent a lot of attention on during the 1990s and forward is that actually all the mammals play. All of the immature mammals play. And one thing that play is rehearsal for behaviors in the future that are either going to be necessary for survival. And so play is practice. Okay, so that's it for the 7 basic affects. I don't feel like I have this in terms of like conveying it to people. I don't think I have this as worked out as I have other parts of this overall syllabus, but it's important stuff, and I hope you find something interesting to think about in this.